You ever get that sudden ache in your gut, the kind that feels like someone's been playing a game behind your back and you can't quite explain why you feel it? Hold on to that feeling for a second, because it's not paranoia. It's your mind trying to warn you about a truth you were never supposed to uncover. And if you stay with me until the very end, I'll give you the one insight that flips the entire power dynamic in your favor, something most men never hear until it's too late. Before we dig in, hit that like button, subscribe, and let's make sure you never walk blind into emotional traps again. Let me talk to you as a psychologist, not as someone telling you what to think, but as someone who has spent years watching how human behavior moves beneath the surface, especially in relationships where emotion, ego, fear, and desire twist together like threads of the same rope. There's a pattern men keep falling for, a pattern that drains their confidence, their clarity, and their ability to see the truth. And the moment a man learns how it works, he stops being easy to influence. He stops being predictable. He stops being controlled. Because here's the part most men never realize. People don't manipulate you by controlling your actions. They manipulate you by controlling your interpretations, your meaning-making machine. If they can get you to question your own value, your own instincts, your own memories, then they don't need to push you. You'll move yourself. The tactic is subtle. Emotional framing. It happens when someone makes you doubt whether your needs are too much, whether your boundaries are controlling, whether your instincts are insecure. Notice, none of those labels describe what you did. They attack who you are. And the instant you start defending yourself, not your actions, but your identity, you've already lost ground. This is where so many men stumble without ever knowing they're stumbling. Because you're wired to fix things. You want peace, you want connection, you want to solve problems. But a manipulative dynamic thrives on your instinct to repair. The more you try to prove you're reasonable, patient, loyal, or understanding, the more leverage you hand over, because now the other person gets to decide whether you've proven it enough. But here's the psychological twist. Not every woman uses this intentionally. Some do it because it works. Some do it because they learned it from past relationships. And some do it because men rarely challenge emotional narratives. They surrender to them. And when you surrender, even unintentionally, the structure of the relationship shifts. You stop being a partner. You start being a performer, waiting for approval that always moves just out of reach. You know what really breaks a man? Not rejection, not loss. It's the slow erosion of self-respect while trying to be good enough in a system designed to keep him unbalanced. And that's exactly what changes the moment you understand how emotional framing works. Because once you see it, you can't unsee it. Once you know the psychology behind it, you stop reacting. You stop negotiating your value. You stop chasing validation. You begin choosing, intentionally, calmly, confidently, based on truth instead of fear. And the second you do that, the entire power dynamic flips. People stop trying to test you. Stop trying to stretch your boundaries. Stop trying to dictate how you should feel. Because a man who sees through emotional framing becomes immune to it. There's a moment in every man's life when he finally realizes something unsettling. Not everyone in his world is responding to who he truly is. Many are responding to the version of him they can benefit from. And the more you try to be the good man, the supportive man, the patient man, the understanding man, the more certain personalities will see your kindness as an opening, not a virtue. This is where the psychology of influence gets dark. Not because women are bad, but because human beings naturally test the limits placed in front of them. And if you don't set yours, someone else will set them for you. Here's a truth most men never hear. Manipulation doesn't start with deception. It starts with dependency, emotional, psychological, or even just attention-based. When someone realizes that your mood rises or falls based on their approval, they know they have a kind of quiet power over you. Not because they're malicious, but because it's human nature to lean into what works. And attention is one of the most powerful currencies in modern relationships. When a woman senses that you're emotionally invested faster than she is, or that you care about the outcome more than she does, she instinctively understands that she can shape the rules of the connection without ever declaring them out loud. You'll notice it in small ways first. She'll expect you to initiate every conversation, and if you don't, she'll let the silence stretch just long enough for you to feel unsettled. She'll pull back slightly, not enough to break things, but enough to make you chase. She'll talk about how busy she is while still posting stories or staying active online. She'll give you emotional breadcrumbs that are just enough to keep your hope alive, but not enough to give you stability or clarity. Now, I want you to understand something crucial. These behaviors don't automatically mean someone is a bad person. They mean they've discovered that you respond predictably to uncertainty. And uncertainty triggers one of the deepest psychological drives in men, the drive to win back equilibrium, to fix what feels off, to re-establish connection. That instinct makes you invest harder, try more, give more, prove more, while she gets to control the pace, the tone, and the emotional temperature of every interaction. This is what I call the male spiral. The more uncertain you feel, the more committed you become. The more committed you become, the more uncertain she can safely make you feel, because she knows, consciously or unconsciously, that you're not going anywhere. The fear of losing her becomes more powerful than the desire to protect yourself. And that's when you become influenceable. That's when your boundaries soften. That's when your standards bend. But there's an even deeper layer to this, and it's the part men rarely talk about because most don't know how to articulate it. When you chase someone's approval, you stop showing up as your grounded, authentic self. You start showing up as a version of you designed to please, to impress, to earn affection. And that version of you, no matter how hard he tries, will never command respect. Because respect isn't built on effort, it's built on self-sufficiency. The moment a man becomes emotionally self-sufficient, everything changes. He stops needing reassurance. He stops overthinking every message. He stops interpreting someone's silence as a sign of his inadequacy. And ironically, that's the moment when people who once tested him begin to feel something they never felt before: uncertainty about what he might do next. When a man is no longer dependent on someone's approval, he becomes unpredictable in the best possible way. He becomes someone who can walk away, someone who can say no, someone who isn't afraid to choose himself. And once you reach that place, truly reach it, you stop being someone who can be emotionally steered, guilted, or pressured. You become someone who sets the tone instead of reacting to it. There's a kind of silence a man feels when he starts waking up to the truth. A quiet shift inside him where he realizes, maybe for the first time, that he hasn't been choosing his relationships. His relationships have been choosing him. And not because he wasn't worthy, but because he didn't know how much leverage he was giving away just by wanting connection more than he wanted clarity. This is where dark psychology becomes visible in real life, not as something mystical or evil, but as simple human behavior amplified by insecurity, desire, and fear of loss. See, the moment someone recognizes that you're afraid to lose them, a psychological switch flips. They don't have to threaten to leave. They just have to let you feel the possibility. A slight pause before responding, a shift in tone, a withdrawn "I'm fine" that leaves you uneasy, and suddenly you find yourself trying to fix an issue that wasn't even clearly stated. This is how power is transferred, not in arguments, but in subtle emotional patterns. And many men don't recognize this because they show loyalty in a very straightforward way. When you care, you stand by someone. When you want someone, you invest more. When things get shaky, you try harder. But certain personalities operate differently. They don't invest based on stability. They invest based on advantage. They watch how you react. They test how quickly you bend. They notice whether you abandon your own standards when you're afraid of disappointing them. This isn't about demonizing anyone. It's about exposing a dynamic that countless men fall into without understanding the psychological mechanics behind it. When you allow someone to control the emotional rhythm of the relationship, they begin to shape the narrative of what's normal. Suddenly, your needs are too sensitive. Your boundaries are overreacting. Your concerns are dramatic. And as soon as you buy into that framing, even once, you've handed over permission for your feelings to be dismissed. The craziest part. It often starts so softly that you barely notice the shift. A woman might say, "I didn't think you'd be upset about that," or "You're reading too much into it," or "Stop being paranoid." None of these statements sound aggressive, but emotionally, they serve one purpose: to make you question your perception, because once you doubt your perception, you rely on theirs instead. And when that happens, you slowly disconnect from your inner compass. You start ignoring red flags. You rationalize things that don't feel right. You begin to compromise before the conversation even begins. You show up eager to fix things while she shows up knowing she doesn't need to. And the inequality widens. But let me give you the psychological truth behind this. People only frame your emotions as wrong when your clarity threatens their control, when your instincts get too sharp, when your ability to see through mixed signals puts them at risk of losing the narrative. That's when they try to soften your confidence. Because a confident man is hard to influence, hard to guilt trip, hard to manipulate. Clarity is dangerous in the best possible way. Because the moment you truly see someone's behavior for what it is, not what you wish it was, the dynamic changes overnight. You stop arguing about tone. You stop begging for reassurance. You stop apologizing just to keep the peace. You walk into conversations with the calm certainty of a man who's not afraid of the truth. And do you know what happens next? The power returns to you, not because you demand it, but because you're no longer operating from fear. Fear of losing her, fear of being wrong, fear of being alone. And once fear leaves your decision-making, every manipulative tactic loses its bite. You stop being predictable. You stop being easy to influence. You stop being someone who can be emotionally steered by uncertainty. You become a man operating from awareness, not attachment. There comes a point where a man finally steps back and realizes something almost chilling. The entire dynamic he thought was normal was never normal at all. It was engineered by repetition, by emotional pressure, by subtle withdrawals, by carefully timed affection, and by the quiet hope that maybe things will get better if I just stay patient. But the truth is, patience without boundaries turns into self-neglect. And self-neglect is exactly what keeps certain dynamics alive. Let me talk to you as a psychologist for a moment. Human behavior follows patterns long before it follows intentions. If someone learns that you'll stay even when you're uncomfortable, that you'll forgive even when they don't acknowledge the issue, that you'll try harder even when they put in less, then they adapt to your tolerance, not out of malice, but out of convenience. Convenience is one of the most underrated forces in modern relationships. When someone realizes you won't walk away, they stop walking toward you with intention. When someone realizes you fear losing them, they stop fearing the consequences of their own behavior. This is why some women, especially those who operate from uncertainty, insecurity, or ego, lean into emotional tactics that keep a man trying, proving, chasing. They don't need grand manipulation. They don't need dramatic scenes. All they need is ambiguity, silence, mixed signals, moments of connection followed by distance, and those shifts create tension in your nervous system. That tension makes you seek relief, and that relief becomes tied to their approval, which gives them control over your emotional state. But here's the psychological twist most men never learn. You weren't chosen for who you are. You were chosen for how well you respond to uncertainty. Not because you're weak, but because you're consistent. You keep showing up. You keep giving chances. You keep trying to understand. You keep absorbing the emotional weight that someone else doesn't want to carry. And that reliability becomes a resource that can be accessed without effort, a resource that can be used without acknowledgement, a resource that becomes so normal that your absence feels less threatening then your presence feels valuable. And this is exactly where men lose themselves, not in dramatic heartbreak, but in slow erosion, the slow surrender of standards, values, boundaries, instincts. You start letting things slide because you don't want conflict. You start hiding your needs because you don't want to push her away. You start tolerating double standards because you'd rather keep the peace than face the truth. You start losing confidence because every concern you bring up gets flipped back on you. And over time, your self-respect gets chipped away by 1,000 tiny hesitations. But here's what makes the difference between a man who breaks and a man who transforms. The moment you stop operating from fear, everything changes. When you stop fearing her silence, you stop being controlled by it. When you stop fearing her disappointment, you stop molding yourself to avoid it. When you stop fearing losing someone who isn't fully choosing you, you finally reclaim control of the story, and something powerful happens next. something most men never experience until they step into this clarity. The dynamic shifts, the mixed signals stop working, the silence loses its power. The emotional distance doesn't trigger panic because you're no longer chasing comfort, you're demanding reciprocity, you're no longer tolerating confusion, you're requiring transparency, you're no longer reacting to behavior, you're evaluating it. And for the first time, you become the one whose actions are unpredictable. You become the one whose standards matter. You become the one who gets to decide whether someone earns continued access to you. That is when you stop being the one who adapts to her behavior and she starts adapting to yours. There's a moment, quiet, powerful, almost unsettling, when a man finally understands that everything he thought he needed from someone else was actually something he needed to reclaim within himself. And that realization doesn't come during arguments or heartbreak. It comes in stillness, when the noise fades, when the anxiety lifts, when the emotional chaos stops feeling like chemistry and starts feeling like what it really was, conditioning. Because here's the truth most men never learn until they're deep inside a draining relationship dynamic. Your attention is a reward. Your effort is a reward. Your loyalty is a reward. Your presence is a reward. But if you don't treat it like one, neither will anyone else. And when someone realizes they can access your loyalty without giving you clarity, access your energy without giving you stability, access your time without giving you respect, they naturally begin to contribute less. Not because you're undeserving, but because you've taught them they don't need to. This is the psychological trap so many men get caught in. You think the harder you try, the more someone will appreciate you. But in real human dynamics, effort without boundaries looks like desperation, and desperation invites disregard. Not because you are weak, but because you make yourself too available, too forgiving, too understanding. And when someone sees that you don't hold yourself to a higher standard, they stop holding themselves to one around you. But here's the part that flips everything upside down. The moment you raise your standard, not for others, but for yourself, the entire dynamic reshapes. Suddenly, you're no longer chasing. You're no longer proving. You're no longer afraid of disappointment. You stop operating from emotional scarcity and start operating from internal abundance. And when that shift happens, something fascinating occurs in the minds of people who once thought they had emotional leverage over you. They feel it, they sense it, they realize they've lost access to the version of you who needed their validation. And this is where female psychology becomes incredibly revealing. When a man stops being predictable, when he no longer bends for breadcrumbs, when he doesn't react to silence, when he stops accepting half effort, the person who once relied on those tactics loses control. And that loss of control triggers a change in their behavior. They either step up or they step out. Either way, you win. Because you're no longer negotiating from fear, you're observing from power. The irony is that the moment you detach emotionally, not in a cold or distant way, but in a grounded, self-respecting way, is the moment you become more attractive, more respected, and more valued. People respond differently to a man who knows he can walk away. Not because he threatens it, but because he's capable of it. A man who can walk away is a man who cannot be manipulated. A man who can walk away is a man who commands respect. A man who can walk away is a man who chooses relationships based on reciprocity, not desperation. And that's the secret shift no one tells men about. When you become the source of your own validation, you stop performing for anyone else's. Your calm becomes your power. Your silence becomes your clarity. Your standards become your shield. Your presence becomes something someone has to earn, not something you hand out to anyone who shows interest. And once you embody that version of yourself, you don't fear losing people anymore. You fear losing yourself. And that fear protects you from the very dynamics that used to drain you, confuse you, or weaken you. You stop asking, how do I keep her? And you start asking, does she align with the man I'm becoming? That's the shift. That's the moment everything changes. And that's the moment male vulnerability transforms into male power. Not through aggression, not through confrontation, but through emotional sovereignty. There's something I need you to understand, and I want you to hear this with the seriousness of a man standing at a turning point in his life. Once you grasp this one truth, the entire psychological game that once confused you, drained you, or controlled you ends. Not because women lose power, not because you become cold or unfeeling, but because you finally stop giving away the one thing that made you easy to influence. Your fear of being alone, your fear of rejection, your fear of not being enough. Because here's the truth they never teach men. You were never supposed to know how powerful you become the moment you stop needing emotional permission to be yourself. Every tactic that once pulled you in, mixed signals, selective affection, emotional distance, sudden warmth followed by withdrawal, only works on a man who doubts his own worth. Once a man knows his value, those tactics lose their effect instantly, not gradually, instantly, because manipulation thrives in confusion and dies in clarity. And clarity is exactly what you're stepping into now. When you stop basing your identity on whether someone chooses you and start basing it on whether you choose yourself, every relationship in your life transforms. You stop giving people the power to define whether you are too much or not enough. You stop chasing love through performance. You stop accepting half effort just because you fear starting over. You stop losing yourself in dynamics that never deserved the best parts of you to begin with. And do you know what happens when you operate from that version of yourself? You become magnetic, not because you're trying to be, not because you're playing any game, but because a man who knows his worth radiates something rare, something people don't encounter often. A calm, grounded certainty. A man who doesn't fold under pressure. A man who doesn't negotiate with disrespect. A man who doesn't get emotionally blackmailed. A man who can love deeply without losing himself. A man who can give without being drained. A man who doesn't need to be impressive because his self-respect speaks louder than any performance ever could. And that right there is the psychology no one wants men to learn. Because the moment you stop being afraid of losing someone, they're the ones who start worrying about losing you. The moment you stop reacting to emotional tests, those tests stop happening. The moment you stop accepting confusion, clarity becomes the bare minimum. The moment you stop being available to people who aren't consistent, consistent people start appearing. And the moment you stop being guided by insecurity, your entire presence changes. You become the kind of man who chooses instead of chasing, who evaluates instead of overreacting, who leads instead of bending, who walks away from what drains him, who invests only where energy is matched, who becomes immune to guilt-tripping, emotional pressure, and psychological games. That's the man women respect. That's the man other men admire. That's the man who doesn't get pulled into toxic cycles. And that's the man you're stepping into the moment you decide you're done giving away power you never needed to give. And if you've watched this far, it tells me something important. You're ready. You're done being controlled by emotion. You're done living with uncertainty. You're done letting fear shape your decisions. You're ready to step into the version of yourself that was always there. Strong, clear, grounded, confident, intentional. If this message hit you in your chest, if something inside you shifted, then make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and stay connected. Because men who understand psychology don't just get better relationships, they get better lives. And trust me, once a man knows this truth, he's never the same again.